Minesweeper is one of those games that you might forget about, especially since it was given away for free in the 90s. If you bought a computer with Windows on it, you got a copy of Minesweeper, amongst other games as well. This is a game that I didn't know too much about the history behind it, and the only thing I really remember was it was annoying, I didn't understand how to play the game, and it was just a stepping stone for me to going back to Rattler Race and playing that instead. So we start off Kyle Orland's book by talking about the origins of Minesweeper. And he brings up a game called Mind Out that was created by Ian Andrew for the ZX Spectrum in the early 80s. Ian is one of the many UK developers that got their start in this kind of cottage industry of computer games in the 80s. And this is something that I want to bring up early on because this is one of those stories that you have to tell in order to tell the story of Minesweeper. There are so many little parts and little stories that go along with Minesweeper that you have to tell in order to tell the entire history of the game. And it's just really cool. So getting back on track, Mind Out has many similarities to Minesweeper, and Kyle points out that this was just one of numerous games that could have inspired Minesweeper along the way. There's a lot of evidence to say that Minesweeper is a clone of Mind Out. However, Minesweeper separates itself by not having the player move an avatar across a minefield, which is something that games like Mind Out and Relentless Logic had the player do. Speaking of Relentless Logic, that's another computer game that could have inspired Minesweeper. Like Mind Out, the player would move an avatar through a minefield, and you would get some indication of where the mines were located, so you kind of knew where you needed to go. These indications were normally just a set of numbers, which got carried over into Minesweeper. If there was a mine near you, you would get a 1. If it was a little farther away from that square, it might be a 2, a 3, or 4, or so on. It was great that Kyle explained that to me because me, in my stupid 10-year-old mind, thought that those were somehow connected to the scoring system in Minesweeper. I didn't spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out Minesweeper, so hearing about its origins and just the way the game is supposed to work was just absolutely fascinating to me. This is where we talk a little bit about the Windows Entertainment Pack. This was something I had no clue about. Again, I was very young when this was released. So yeah, I had no concept that Microsoft tried to sell all the games that would eventually be pre-installed to many of the versions of Windows that I either remember fondly or don't remember at all for some reason or another. I only remember these games being pre-installed on Windows 95 and then on Windows 98, and then I stopped caring because I was playing other games at the time, which arguably are much better than many of these kind of time waster games. The games that were on the Windows Entertainment Pack were some of the first games that I played on my family's computer. This is an experience that I'm sure many people had. Kyle points out how these games used to teach people how to use computers. So something like Minesweeper would teach you how to use the mouse, where you right-click and that leaves a flag, left-click and it does a different action. It's a nice way to think about these things. These games were also used to teach programmers at Microsoft how to program for Windows. So in many ways, Minesweeper was made as a teaching tool, much like it was used as a teaching tool. Many simple video games were made at Microsoft during the 80s and 90s. These games, as I mentioned, help programmers learn how to write programs for Windows. It reminds me of other stories I've read about people working on computers and at other tech companies and just doing certain things in order to learn how to actually program for it or how to make another game. They would try to make something really simple at first, let's say make a Space Invaders clone, and that would teach them what they needed to do in order to make a much larger project. Kyle points out how there was pushback against making a commercial product about these simple games or around these simple games because Microsoft's management saw themselves as a big, serious company, and they were kind of above making these kids' games. The department working on the Windows Entertainment Pack wasn't getting a whole lot of support from just the different parts of the company. Fortunately, the pushback wasn't really good enough to do a whole lot. They didn't really try to stop the entertainment pack from happening. They just didn't try to help it along the way. And this pack was able to kind of push itself through and get done. There are some amazing stories about what needed to be done in order to release these games, like how little money was allocated to the production. It was fascinating to read about that sort of thing, just because I had no idea. Like, hey, you are only allotted 10% of what we're going to make off of this game. So your total production cost for this can't exceed like $2 or something weird like that. And there's just an amazing story in here about how the department manager for the Windows Entertainment Pack had to cobble together the manual on one page by himself and then had to drive to like a printing shop, get these manuals, which are really just a page, printed out on the cheapest possible paper, then bring these 10,000 sheets of paper to the packing plant and drop them off so they can be stuffed in. And he did all of this on his own dime because they just didn't have the money to do this, at least in the production budget. Kyle also talks about kind of the minor moral panic around Minesweeper and other casual games that were pre-installed on computers at the time. Specifically Solitaire, but I'm sure plenty of other ones gave managers fits at this time. This was around the period when computers were becoming more accessible and you had Windows kind of taking over as the dominant operating system for the PC. At least that's my reading of all of this. By all means, correct me in the comments below. He brings up like how the concerns in this moral panic weren't about violence in video games, obviously. They were about lowering worker productivity. And he brings up a few editorials which are kind of laughable when you read them now, and also a bunch of cases where state and federal governments were trying to ban computer games at work, so they would demand that all of the games be removed from their computer systems. This came after the first wave of concerns about video game violence and the creation of the ESRB. It's kind of interesting that this little moral panic got started over something concerning Minesweeper and Solitaire. And yeah, it just kind of seems like a continuation of video games being terrible and people not understanding them or not liking them, so they decide they need to get rid of them. The way these people talk about playing games, it in many ways reminds me of the nonsense you hear from people talking about play-to-earn games. You know, playing games is seen as unproductive, and people should be earning money instead of relaxing for a few minutes or a few hours at a time. It's just kind of comical when you think about it, and I had a really good chuckle when I was reading this. The funny story about Minesweeper's impact on productivity concerns Bill Gates. He got obsessed with the game. As the story goes, Bill wanted to set the fastest time on the beginner difficulty, and it got to the point where the game was removed from his computer, and he would break into other executives' offices to play the game. Finally, someone created a program that was able to automatically play the game, and it set just an unbeatable time. So Gates sent out this email after he learned about it, suggesting that he might try to move on to the intermediate difficulty and work from there. It was just a really funny story, and this is one of the cases where video games can have a negative impact on people's lives, but it's still more comical than anything. There are a lot more stories that could fit into this section, but I don't want to create an entire summary of the book here. These are just some of the parts of this story that I find really humorous, and it's just part of, the story of a simple game. The story of Minesweeper is much more fascinating than I initially thought. It's really been a great journey to read through this. Did you know that a competitive scene was created around Minesweeper? Because I had no idea before reading this book, but once I took a step back and I realized, yeah, this is just another example of a fan base around a video game or TV show or anything really, creating a space for themselves on the internet. Damian Moore created a way to track high scores for Minesweeper in the late 90s and the early 2000s. This was kind of during the internet's infancy, and many video games would eventually have fan sites created for them. So Minesweeper wasn't an oddity or anything, it just feels a little weird because, well, it's Minesweeper. Even though it is an incredibly popular game and it sold millions of units, it was still one of those free pack-in games, so knowing that it has a fan base and everything can seem a little weird at times. Because this was the early internet, there weren't forums or message boards, really. This website had a guestbook, and that was how the visitors would communicate to each other. Kyle does a better job of describing the way guestbooks work, especially since I don't really have any experience with using them. I do know it was just a place you would go, post some message to somebody, and then it would constantly track that. So they were kind of unwieldy and a little bit hard to read through, if my reading of what Kyle's description is even remotely accurate. As the community grew, we would hear how people would try to fake scores. This reminds me of Twin Galaxies and how many of their early scores were fabricated, but unlike the high scores that Twin Galaxies was making up, Minesweeper's community came up with ways to actually track those. Not just looking at pictures of, not just looking at pictures that had been created in Microsoft Paint or edited in Microsoft Paint, but they would also come up with ways to track the number of clicks that it took you in order to get that high score. It's fascinating to see how they use this method to count clicks. This was really interesting for me to read about. The community would also get deeper into the game, and they would find out just how the game really functioned, and that there was some repetition to the different boards and how they would appear. So you wouldn't get like a pre-generated board every time. You could eventually show up on the same board, or you could get a board twice, because there were only about 12,000 possible boards on certain levels, specifically with intermediate, which ties into the dream board that we're going to talk about in just a second. The dream board in Minesweeper is a board on intermediate difficulty, and it's easier to solve than a lot of the others, and this is where a lot of high scores and world records were set. Because this board became so easy to get, or so predictable to get, and people would study and practice on this board to get as fast as they possibly could. Kyle does a much better job of explaining this, and I like how he breaks it down with pictures explaining where all the mines were on these boards and how easy it was to actually get it, as well as breaking down the frequency of getting this board. The Dream Board brought up an issue with the high score community. Some players thought that level memorization was a form of cheating, and it became an issue between really like the two sides of this whole argument, and eventually a committee was created to settle this debate. It didn't settle the debate. The issue was, never really resolved by them. And after a year of talking about this, the committee was quietly dissolved. Instead of creating rules for this perceived cheating, the community set about fixing the bugs that caused the repetition and patterns in the boards. This led to my favorite part of the book, the different revisions and clones of Minesweeper. Minesweeper and Microsoft's other casual games would move to the App Store instead of being on the Start menu as Windows continued to get updated. Things had to change, and the pre-installed games would change along with them. Some of these changes were for the better, and to their credit, Microsoft would change directions whenever they made some unpopular decision or people complained about certain things. Speaking of unpopular decisions and people complaining about certain things, when Windows 8 was released, the pre-installed games were completely removed from the operating system and placed in Windows App Store. Minesweeper and the other pre-installed games were going to be free downloads, but you had to know where to go and how to get them. This is yet another reason why Windows 8 sucked. A lot. Like, just an awful lot. I could probably go on longer, but Windows 8 sucked. And having an app store didn't really help everybody out because you had some people that didn't know about that and didn't know where the app store was, didn't know how to find Minesweeper or many of the other games. And just based on my personal experience, a lot of people have no goddamn idea how a search button works. It's kind of amazing at times. When Windows 10 was released, the pre-install games were brought back. However, Minesweeper wasn't one of the games that was pre-installed, and it remained a free download in the App Store. It was returned to the Start menu under Windows 11. I don't think my computer has Windows 11 because when I went to go look for it, I didn't really see it. So, yeah, just my own experience probably doesn't really help too much here. However, this did help bring Minesweeper back to people's attention. I wonder how many people still play Minesweeper, to be honest, but it has to be enough to keep the game popular, or at least keep Microsoft updating it. In 2011, Microsoft's casual games division started updating games like Minesweeper. An adventure mode was added that was similar to the games that were released in the 80s, and advertisements were also added to the game. When I checked out Minesweeper after reading this book, yeah, there are quite a number of ads here, and if you want them to go away, you had to buy a subscription, which I was not motivated to do because I'm not paying them money so I can play Minesweeper. I'm sorry to everybody who wanted to know more about that. I just did not feel like doing it for this book. This change brought Minesweeper in line with other casual games and mobile games as well. You can make these advertisements go away, as I mentioned, but yeah, not everyone did. It's one of the things that I dislike about casual and mobile games, but it's probably here to stay. You don't have to play Microsoft's version of Minesweeper because there are plenty of clones out there now, just because of the fact that the game is so old and you can make clones of something without just outright copying it. I mean, just look back at the same games that Minesweeper was based off of and see how many versions of that there are. And then you can open up your phone and type in Minesweeper, and you'll probably get a dozen or 2 dozen just different versions of the game. there's not too much difference between them, but yeah, it's fine. I like Minesweeper, but I don't like it enough to actually pay for it. This was one of the more investigative and historical books from Boss Fight Books. The personal stories about the games are usually my favorite, but this historical look at a game that I didn't know much about the history of was really a great read, and Kyle Orland did a great job of telling its story. Putting the reach of Minesweeper in perspective for me in regards to the install base was highly informative. Because it was a free game that Microsoft gave away, it can be difficult to really compare it to other games that were sold in stores. Minesweeper was sold alongside millions of computers until Microsoft removed it from the start menu, which may have harmed its popularity quite a bit. The story of Minesweeper is one of those parts of video game history that touches on many other stories. There are so many smaller stories tied to Minesweeper, and each of them is fascinating in their own right. Kyle does an excellent job of bringing all of these parts of the story together and telling a compelling story about a simple game. So that's going to wrap things up, guys. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.